welcome to this month's webinar between Classical Wisdom and Civic Renaissance. I'll turn you over to Lexi, who will introduce our fantastic guest today and will help moderate. And I just want to say thank you for joining us, and we'll be doing a bunch of Q&A at the end as well. So please feel free to write in questions in the chat throughout. So on to Lexi.
Thanks, Xenia, and thanks everyone for being here, taking a bit of time out of your Saturday to talk about ritual and manners and norms in the ancient world and how they can help us think more clearly about our norms and values today and life today. I'm really thrilled and honored to have Margaret Visser with us here today. So I'll introduce Margaret, give a little bit of her background for you all, and then we'll begin our conversation about norms and manners in the ancient world and how they can help us think more clearly about our life today. So Margaret Visser writes on history, anthropology, and mythology of everyday life. Her most recent book is The Gift of Thanks, published by HarperCollins. Her previous book, Much Depends on Dinner, The Rituals of Dinner, The Way We Are, and The Geometry of Love, have been bestsellers and won major international awards, including the Glenfiddich Award for Food Book of the Year in Britain in 1989, the International Association of Culinary Professionals Literary Food Writing Award, and the Jane Grigson Award. In 2002, she gave the Massey Lecture on CBC Radio, subsequently published as a book, best-selling book called Beyond Fate. Her books have been translated into French, German, Dutch, Spanish, Italian, and Portuguese, and she appears frequently on radio and television and has lectured extensively across Canada, the United States, Europe, and Australia. And she divides her time between Paris, Toronto, and Southwest France. Although I think, Margaret, you're mostly in France these days.
Yeah, more or less.
Margaret and her husband, Colin, were so gracious and welcomed my husband, our 18-month-old son, and I to her beautiful home in the south of France this past summer, where we got to meet in person for the first time at their lovely, lovely, lovely home. And so it was wonderful to meet in person. I think we've all kind of resigned ourselves to the Zoom medium. So it's a real treat to have in-person interactions when we can and when it's safe to do so. So it's been a privilege to get to know Margaret, and I've been a longtime admirer of her work, and excited to talk about the ancient world today. Margaret is a classicist. That wasn't actually mentioned in her biography, but she's a trained classicist and taught classics at York University in Toronto for a number of years. Before she started writing about how the ancient world can help us understand our world today. And then she became a full-time writer, and that's been her kind of second career, but classics was her first love, and maybe still is your first love, Margaret. But so tell us, Margaret, walk us through, give us an example of why and how knowing about the ancient world can help us think more clearly about our lives today and informs our social norms today. Maybe, for example, walk us through a dinner party in ancient Greece. What might be similar to us, and what might be surprising or different than how we do things today?
Well, I don't know what you mean by a meal, but I mean, I probably mean a banquet in ancient Greece, because that's what surprises people most. The great surprise, when you first see it, is that people eat lying down, not sitting up around a table, okay? And they're all lying back, and they've all got these huge bowls of wine about this size. And every now and then they have a game or something, and they throw the wine across the room to hit a statuette that will fall onto a plate, and this makes a big loud clang, and that's a win for this game. So in other words, they didn't just have a symposium, which is what I'm describing. They had games and things in between. And they also had women would come in occasionally to play the flute, and to perhaps have sex with them on their beds. It's not at all like a dinner party today. Well, it's all the differences are perhaps even more than the similarities. Have you got any idea of what do you think is different about what I've just described?
Well, I mean, so what's one really funny thing, when Anya and I put together this conversation, we created a poster to, promote via email and social media. And when I sent this poster and the Eventbrite to Margaret saying, hey, by the way, this is what we're using to promote the event, she said to me, there's something very wrong about this poster. Can you tell what it is? And I couldn't figure out what was wrong with the poster. The poster had a bunch of Greeks probably at a symposium, drinking wine and laying on their side, reclined in sort of a repose. But so Margaret, tell us, what was wrong with the poster? What was historically inaccurate?
What was wrong with the poster was that everybody was leaning on their right elbow.
Okay.
With their left hand. Now, first of all, you couldn't do that. You had to lean on your left elbow and eat with your right hand. And anybody who was left-handed had to just do that. Because if you didn't lean on the left elbow, you would be facing the wrong direction. So if you're all lying down and one person decides to lean this way, then the whole configuration of the meal is destroyed. So if you all had to lean on your left elbow and eat with your right hand, which is interesting because there's a huge taboo throughout the world, actually. Very, very often, people are not allowed to eat food with their left hand. It's a taboo hand, it's profane, okay? So in other words, you can't show a Greek symposium, everybody leaning on their right shoulder and eating with their left hand. That's what I meant.
Now, I was curious because the full image actually had people going around the table. So would everybody have just been sitting in one direction, even if they went around, or would you have like different chairs around the table, around the room? I don't know if that question makes sense.
Well, there would be no chairs, okay? You just had table. You had people lying down. In front of each bed is a table just a little lower than the bed. And on that table, the servants, the slaves, so lots of slaves, would come in with food laid out on this table. No trays or anything like that. It's just a table. And then when they'd finished eating, the slaves would come in and clean the tables, carry them away, and come back with another course, also laid out on the same table, but cleaned with a sponge. So there's no plates. What else is there? What else do they not have? No chairs, no trays. What
no
else?
Cutlery, I guess.
No forks.
No knives, no forks, all eaten with their hands, okay? And then, as I say, first of all, you'd have the meal, and you'd have a little bit to drink with the meal just to wash it down, but that wasn't really considered drinking. They divided the meal into two. The first part is for eating, and the second part is for drinking. And before they started the meal, they had all drawn lots for somebody to be the head of the meal, the symposiarch, the leader of the symposium. And he decided how much wine you mixed with, how much water you mixed into your wine, because it was considered barbaric to drink wine without water in it. I might add that the water was salt water from the sea, so it must have made it taste very good. And this person would also decide how many glasses you had. Glasses, I said glasses. It's ceramic pots about this size, okay? And how many of those you would drink and so on. And then they also, during the eating part of the meal, they would discuss what they were going to talk about. And then they would make a decision. And then when it came time for the symposium, everything would stop. They would sing a hymn. They would pour libations from their wine onto the floor. What were they doing then? Why were they pouring wine onto the floor? Do you know? It's called libations. You poured a little of the wine. You were offering it to the gods. So they were inviting the gods to their meal and giving them pieces of meat from their, if there was meat. There often wasn't, but if there was meat, they would offer a piece of meat to the gods as well. So it's a very, there's a very religious aspect to a meal. And they would then say, he would say, okay, now the first person to speak about the subject is you. And then they'd have to give a speech about what they thought. Now, what I'm describing now actually is a particular dinner, which was by Plato. Plato's famous dialogue, the Symposium, which is considered to be one of the most important documents in philosophy in the whole of the Western world. So it's not just a dinner time chat. This is Plato discussing what is love. And the first person had to talk, the second person talked, and then finally you get to Socrates, and he tells you what he thinks love is. And that it's a very provocative talk, and people are still discussing it because it implies all kinds of things which we now question, but nobody can take Plato lightly because he is way beyond us still in many ways in the way he thought. So then at the end of the meal, they would all sing another hymn. And by the way, when they started the symposium part of the meal, all the guests would put on wreaths on their hair. That's a plaited leaves around their head. And that was a crown. And in ancient Greece, that crown just explained two things. One of them was that the god Prometheus had shown human beings how to be able to eat the meat of an animal, because originally they would kill an animal and they would just give it to the gods. And Prometheus made the gods agree that they would be happy with just bones and fat, and the human beings would eat the meat. And they were very grateful to Prometheus, who also introduced them to fire and all sorts of things like that. And then he was crucified, he was nailed to a rock for thousands of years, until a human being came who was strong enough, brave enough to save Prometheus. And when he saved Prometheus, from that day forward, human beings ate the meat of their own animal that they'd killed. The gods smelt the perfume of the fat from where the bones were wrapped in fat and then cooked. And the gods were content with that. And everybody was content and harmonious. But the crown reminded these people of what Prometheus had done for them. And secondly, a crown in ancient Greek thinking represented the fate of the person wearing it. Ancient Greeks thought that fate was a geometrical idea, and that your life is a circle, and they wore that circle on their heads. It was very important and very emotional for them to wear a crown like that. So the meal included that. The meal also included perfumes, pouring perfumes all over them. In ancient Egypt, they used to put a huge cone of perfume on their heads, and it would drizzle down over their faces and bodies while they ate. This is part of the joy of a banquet in ancient Greece. Now, if you can see where the connections are with our meals, I'd be very interested to hear. Do you see what the connection is with our meals? What do they say? What does all this mean? What is what they were doing? What did it mean to them?
So one commonality between dining and banqueting in the ancient world till today is that I'm looking at your book, The Rituals of Dinner, right now, and here it is. And one thing you link the etymology of symposium to the word sympathetic or sympa, and how a sympodikos was someone with whom you felt with, and someone with whom you enjoyed a symposium with. So like how meals bring us together. They are venues of camaraderie and of conviviality, of friendship and of community. And that's still something that holds true today. That's still very much a part of.
Who were the guests in this symposium that we've got? How would they have a party? They'd have a party by inviting their friends into their house. And there would be about 9 people at the meal.
Okay.
Sometimes slightly less, sometimes slightly more, but 9 people. And they were all men. That is very important. Okay. You wouldn't believe so, because I was just reading a book about, I was reading my Oxford Classical Dictionary just now, and I looked up symposium just to see what they said, and they don't even mention the fact. Now, this is published now, this is today. The classicists don't mention that the symposium never had a female in it.
Why is that? It was just not culturally done at the time? Or do they have their own symposiums, female-only symposiums?
You didn't ask why they were lying down. That's number one. They were lying down because in the 7th century, the Greeks were fighting, that is, in the Eastern Mediterranean, and they came across the Assyrians, which you know from the Bible, right? The Assyrians were a Semitic people, very, very, and they noticed with fascination, because of plaques, which we still have in our museums, of people lying down to eat. And the female is sitting in a chair next to the male. The chair is a lower position. Now, you mentioned when you were saying about food and all that, it was all about community. Having meals together is, first of all, go back to the beginning of the book, it's something that only human beings do. You don't have cats or birds or whatever. They will bring food to their young and feed them and look after them, but they don't have a group of people to whom they say, there's some for you and some for you and some for you and some for you. It's a human behavior. And it's one of the ways, one of the earliest and most powerful ways human beings have ever devised of starting a society of people. And having meals together has always meant for us community. And the people who eat with you are companions. And as you probably know, the word companion means bread with. We eat bread with others, companion.
Pain, you're right. Like pain is bread, yes.
Like a pantry, companion. And we eat together and we have companions as a result. So sharing food is one of the ways human beings have created civilizations from the very beginning. First societies and then civilizations. And that's basic. It means sharing. However, when you sit down to a meal, even if you don't have knives and forks, even if you just have your hands, you have your teeth. And you are very close together and you're all hungry. And it is extraordinary that we've put such a heavy taboo on this fact, but it's still a fact. A meal is very dangerous. In our culture, we actually have weapons on the table. We have the close quarters. Any moment you can have a fight. And in fact, sociologists today say that almost all fights in the family start at the meal table. So it's just typical. Huh? And one of the things that table manners are about is about preventing, never allowing to arise, any possibility of violence. It is extremely important that this meal, which we're eating partly to create community, it should work. It should work. It should not break down in violence. If we've eaten together and we haven't fought, we've won a victory. We've actually done it. We're friends. We've proved it. So table manners are one of the basic building blocks of civilization. They are, if you don't have them, you will have violence very soon, okay? So human beings know this, but they don't think about it. One of the powers of a taboo, that a taboo is a word that comes from Southeast, East Asian cultures. They have this word taboo. A thing is taboo when you do it, but you don't understand why, but you still, you do it even more because you don't understand it. You just know that you must do this. And you don't think about it. You do it before, it goes before thought. Taboos exist before thought. Okay? So a young man goes and asks his dad if he can borrow the car. And he is quite capable of killing his father and taking the car. But he doesn't, because he knows that this is not what you could, it's not done. In our culture, it's not, we say it's not done, which is a very weak way of saying it's a taboo. You don't do it, you don't think about it, it just doesn't enter your head. And people still think, and they say to me all the time, oh, I've never seen anyone being violent at the table. And I do not say, oh, you're very lucky, because but we are. I mean, we've worked it out. So it's not to be taken lightly. I mean, I said before we started this conversation, I was having another conversation, I was saying that manners are not virtue. They're a pretense at virtue. They're an imposition of a taboo. Table manners are. There are other kinds of manners. Table manners are specifically a prevention of violence at the dinner table. And if you don't have violence, that's because your table manners are working. You are behaving, as we said.
That's a recurring idea. That's a recurring idea in your work, Margaret, how manners, we don't even realize them. They're like the air that we breathe. They're just the things that we are socialized to comply with, and how the whole purpose is to not notice them. That's actually they're very much their function. They kind of coordinate and harmonize our interactions with strangers and others, and also loved ones and intimates. And as you noted, it's when they're broken that we notice them. That's how we can sense how strong a norm is.
The phrase is, infractions make news.
There you go. Infractions. So speaking of infractions making news, to take a very famous example from the classical world, from mythology, an example that you discuss at length in your book, The Rituals of Dinner, is Clytemnestra's murder of Agamemnon after he comes back from the Trojan War. And of course, there are two myths that talk about how Agamemnon died. One is at the dinner table, and one is at when he's in the bath, and then she throws a net over him and stabs him to death. And how you just talked at length, very insightfully, about why that was such a scandalizing story, because the dinner table was sacred. It's already so vulnerable. It's already so prone to violence, because you're consuming things. You have everything's a potential weapon. You're in close proximity. That to break that norm of harmony and trust at the dinner table, like that was very scandalous and horrible. And the same is true in the bath. Like you use the phrase that they are mythic equivalents, even though there are two accounts of Agamemnon's death, that they are essentially the same thing, that they are both, rendering someone who's already very vulnerable, both in the bath or at a dinner table, taking advantage of that vulnerability and exploiting it to detrimental ends. So I really appreciated that insight.
Well, what happens when somebody's murdered at the table, or alternatively murdered by the wife, a man murdered by his wife in the bath, with a net put over him, and she hacks him to death, and then shown to the audience when they bring it out. You see her standing there. The result of such a crime is pollution. Now, this is fundamental. In the modern world, we talk about pollution, and we get it from the ancient world, but the idea of pollution is basically doing the wrong thing. Just when you should do the right thing, you do the wrong thing. It's matter out of place. It's socks on the breakfast table. It's you turn on the tap and out comes shit. That's pollution. Pollution. It's the result of it. You see, it's very easy for human beings to think of something immoral as causing a physical result. And the ancients took this very seriously. And the dinner table it cannot be polluted. It is too horrible to think about. Okay, it's a sacred thing, and if you mess it up, you cause murder upon murder for generations. This is what happened in the house of Atreus, because this man came and killed his brother's children and served them up to his father in a pie. Okay, now that is not done. Okay, it caused pollution, and there was going to be hell for years and generations to come. That has, in the modern world, we have sort of greatly toned down that idea of pollution, because it has all kinds of terrible things associated with it, which I won't go into now, that we have got rid of it largely. But what we've left is what pollution also is in the ancient world: dirt. There must be no dirt on the table. When we eat, we must be clean. Everybody agrees about that. Nobody argues about that. If somebody comes to the dinner table and is filthy, it is not accepted. Okay? So that's our lessening of a very powerful idea, which is still underlies things, because you can see now that we are destroying the earth, we are polluting the earth. Okay? So we know what that is, even though we don't think of it right, because if you did, I'm going to have to talk about it for 3 hours to explain it, but it's huge, huge. But we know it. That's why we use that word. It's a serious crime against nature, and we will pay for it. So that is part of the meal. You must be clean. All cultures have this, by the way. All culture, no culture likes to eat a meal that's not clean. It's not because we believe in germs, because a lot of people haven't heard of germs yet, right? But we just know that this can't happen. It's really very bad. So there are all kinds of ways of protecting people when they're eating. And that's one of them. You've got to be clean.
Can I just say, it's really interesting, the comparison of pollution in the ancient world to today, in that you think of the house of Atreus and it's multi-generational. There's that concept that you can inherit the sins of your father, and that pollution transcends to the progeny. And I would say that would be like a major difference today, that, you know, that we try to separate ourselves from our generations. And I mean, maybe the global pollution is more an example of a multi-generational form of pollution, but we've lost that, I think, that connection to our ancestors.
I think we should learn about it again, actually. People use the word showing that they do understand, and behind it all is the sort of thing that Socrates would have loved. He would love to describe, make you say it, you know, because he knows that you know. And we know, but we won't look at it because it's too awful to look at. In fact, we've got to a point where we must look at it. Okay, we must, because if we don't, we won't survive. Okay, so that's the sort of thing, you know, it seems very trivial when we're writing about table manners. As people, you think, oh my God, why am I reading about this? I know my table manners. But if you don't understand where they come from, you're missing something in why we behave the way we do. And that's why I wrote about it. But that was one of the things. That's the pollution angle. I had another idea in mind, but I've forgotten what it is now. But I think, well, you said that I should just talk about how we're like the Greeks, okay? But we're not like the Greeks. Well, the ancient Greeks thought that when you meet together with your friends, you must have a really good conversation. You know, you owe it to them. It's part of hospitality. You must do your thing, show who you are, say what you think, and all that. Argue, do anything, but you must talk. And they put aside the whole second half of the meal, where you don't eat anymore. You just drink. And the drink helps you to sort of let go of your inhibitions. Yes, true, but it also lets you helps you to think. And so they thought, and Plato is the great example, but there are many others. He described what they said at this dinner party. And he starts by saying, nobody ever discusses love. Nobody talks about it. I want you to talk about love. And then he makes them talk. And the really awful thing about in my opinion, about this kind of banquet is that there were no women. Women were not educated. They were excluded from intellectual pursuits. They were not allowed at the dinner party. Their opinions were not heard. I mean, if ever we wanted something to change, that should be it. And the Greeks have got nothing to teach us about that. They were real misogynists, really profoundly misogynist people, including Plato. You can't excuse Plato. Plato thought that, women are just not worth talking to. They were almost animal.
Yeah, you had to be a prostitute to be able to talk at the table, right?
Yeah, that's it. They did allow women who were prostitutes. They could come in because they could, if they felt like, they did right in front of everybody, no problem. Yeah. And they used to dance and play and all this stuff. And then it turned out that quite a lot of they were called hetairai. The hetairai, the prostitutes, were the women who knew something. Mm-hmm. And they were very intelligent quite often. And they had things to say and they were listened to in some rare cases. But you cannot go to the Greeks to learn about how to treat women, okay? Just forget it. It's not worth even looking because they were such misogynists. I mean, the Taliban are direct descendants of the ancient Greeks. Don't educate women. They must not know. We need them to be subordinate. They must serve us. We are the men and they must serve us. And do not teach them a thing. So it's not very nice. They might be very polite to each other, but there's something really seriously wrong.
One area of ancient Greek life and culture that maybe we can learn from is the notion of how to treat strangers and show hospitality to the stranger. The concept of Xenia or Xenia that was incredibly important to the ancient Greeks, and it's all throughout the Odyssey, because Odysseus is often the stranger. He's often the person coming to a new place and is utterly dependent on the benevolence of, or subject to the hostility of, the strange place that he's found himself. And always, Homer seems to be lauding the kindness of the stranger and punishing or making to seem barbaric the people group or persons that exploits the vulnerability of the stranger, the person in need of food and of shelter. And Zeus himself was the god was Xenos, right? Like the god of the stranger. So what do you think that we can learn from this ethic of hospitality to the stranger and Xenia and the norms and ethics of, it was kind of this general reciprocity. Like there wasn't a well-developed system. We didn't have credit cards. There wasn't like well-developed transit systems. It was kind of like either you were dependent on the benevolence of utter strangers or you died in the wilderness, and slept on the side of the road. And often and this is interesting that you find this across culture, this kind of ethic of in the ancient world, this ethic of opening your home, whether it's Abraham and the strangers, there's roots and stories about this in Eastern texts and cultures as well. So what do you think that says about us, Margaret, about the norms of the ancient world, and maybe that's something that we can revive today?
Well, the ancients, you're quite right. I mean, the Greeks were very clear about how you're supposed to treat a stranger. When Odysseus finds an island and sort of comes out of the sea and goes to find the people who are in charge, and they take him in, they give him a meal, and they don't even ask his name until he's had a good dinner. Okay?
Yeah.
That says a lot. I mean, it's a common humanity idea that they were capable of seeing that as foreigner. It might be them one day. If ever I'm a foreigner, I want people to treat me the way I'm treating this man now. So, I mean, hospitality is absolutely well known to the Greeks, and they were fine about that. And it goes together, however, with another aspect of the ancient Greeks, which I don't go into in the book because it's not really about dinner, but it's what's called shame. In ancient Greece, people thought about what their reputation was in the eyes of other people. And if their reputation was slighted, they were completely desolate because they were ashamed. Shame is something others put upon a person, right? And the ancient Greeks really felt they were a shame culture. What they were not was what Christianity is, which is a guilt culture. People feel that I am to blame. I am a sinner. What have I done? No, they thought about, what do these people think of me? It was the externals mattered so much more. And you'll find that all modern cultures that are shame cultures are hospitality cultures as well. It's very interesting. They go together. The generosity to the stranger goes together with the whole nexus of beliefs that go into shame culture. And the Greeks are a perfect example of that. So you're absolutely right about that. In fact, the Odyssey is so full of, how do I treat a stranger? What is dinner like when I first arrive? What's it like to be hungry? It's about having meals. They're meal upon meal upon meal upon meal in the Odyssey. And that's perhaps why I got interested in food in the first place, because I was teaching the Odyssey. And the students loved it. They just loved to hear about the food in the Odyssey. So I realized as modern people have a longing to know about food. And I was right. I did all my work came from that. But that's just the Odyssey. There are other. I mean, you don't get it in the Iliad because they're so busy fighting. They haven't got time to eat, basically. You know? So the Odyssey is full of it. So what else?
I know, Anya, you've written a lot about Xenia as well, and the norms of Xenia, and talked about that at Classical Wisdom. Anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, and it's amazing that when people find out the concept of Xenia, you realize, like, as you just said, Margaret, it's really one of the most underlying principles of the entire Odyssey. And in fact, like, you think the transgression of Xenia, when Odysseus is rude to his host, the Cyclops, kind of sets off the whole story to begin with. So every transgression against it is really the starting point of the pollution, which you've been discussing earlier. So it really is interesting how that all connects.
Yes. And meals are very important in this sense, that they are a host having guests. Because when we talk about meals in the ancient world, it's very often the host and the guest relationship. It's not like a restaurant, you know, as somebody in your house. And the idea of the host and the guest is very, very ancient. It's pre-Greek. It's Indo-European, because it comes from an Indo-European word. The word is gostis or hostis, Ghostis, hostis. It's both the word that you get host from and the word you get guest from, which tells us that hosts and guests go together. One is impossible without the other. And that word hostis expresses a drama that's going to take place, but with a host inviting guests. And if you look at it closely, you will realize that hostis is the root of the word hostile. So when you have a foreigner, a stranger, come into your house, you're afraid. You're afraid. This man has pierced your walls, has come into your house, and is he going to grab your wife, as Menelaus did, and ran off with Helen and started the Trojan War?
Right.
It's a terrifying thing, okay? So the host-guest relationship is fundamental, and this is, again, part of what underlies the meal that I was trying to tell you about.
Yeah.
danger behind the meal, and that you must make this stranger into a guest. You've got to transform him from being a stranger into a guest. And the host spends all his time trying to be kind, be nicer to him than the other people, give him the best piece or whatever it is he wants. The host is trying to make a friend of this guest. And then the ancients had another thing, which is even more extraordinary, and that was, if you ever had been a guest in the house of a man, powerful, I suppose, and you were in a war, because we see this in the Iliad. There's a man who's had dinner with this host, and he was a guest, and he refuses to fight him in the middle of a battle. Okay, it's as strong as that. You've entered into a relationship. So host-guest can become a close relationship, and that's very important in ancient Greece too. And there's a whole thing about the word hospice is where we get hospitality from. A hospice in ancient Rome was a person who agreed to have a stranger in his house, and he stood for that stranger. He took responsibility for him, and he became him in a sort of way. He was a hospice. He was the stranger. This man stood for the stranger in the eyes of the state of Rome. So that's also, but that's a further along, but it's still part of that hospitality theme.
There's actually a question from Jane about stranger, and I'd love to ask a question and also expand it out a bit more, if I may, just quickly interject. Is we talk about these famous banquets and these the men and all this, and I think there's like a trend happening now with the classics and stuff, is to try to pay attention to what all the other people were doing. So I would love to ask, how did the servants eat? How did the women eat? How did people have breakfast? But another question that from Jane, just to bring it kind of together too, is that she said, but who gets to be the stranger? Is it just men who get that hospitality? Would women or slaves? What are the expectations of the person who could be treated to hospitality as a stranger? So maybe that combined, how was everybody else living?
Yes. Well, that's a very difficult question to answer, because we are very unusual nowadays in being interested in asking such a thing. In the past, it's extraordinary how hard it is to find out about simple things like the ones, the questions you've just asked. What did the slaves do? What did the woman do? Was a woman ever a stranger? It's inconceivable. I mean, first of all, a woman wouldn't be traveling around like Odysseus did. She wouldn't. It wouldn't happen. A slave, if he runs, I'm a slave, well, he would be treated like a slave. He would not be like Odysseus. Odysseus is able to say, I am the son of so-and-so, and I'm traveling, and I fought in the war, and and they went, oh, okay. But that's what Homer chose to tell us about. There's so much in life that we don't hear from the great hero stories, okay? And my husband and I were just sitting last night, we were thinking, now, what did they do when everybody had a table? I'm going back to the supper, okay? Everybody had a table. Why didn't they have trays? Why did they put all the food on a table, which means taking the whole table away every time they changed the courses, you see? And I realized we don't know what happened. We don't know what happened, because nobody ever thought it worth telling us. You have to be aware that when you read literature, especially ancient literature, but any literature, people only tell you about things that they saw and they think you didn't know. But if anybody thinks that you knew, they don't tell you. So nobody ever tells you what table manners they had. Nobody.
Because they assume you know it.
And they assume you know. You learned it at the age of 3, So there's so many things we don't know. And it's not because we're lazy. On the contrary, we're unbelievably hardworking in classics to find everything we can, But the things we will never know. We weren't there, and they weren't interested. And let me tell you this, even more amazing if you read novels, try and find out what they often have meals in novels, right? And try and find out what they were eating. They don't tell you. Jane Austen is not interested in what people were eating. She was interested in where they were sitting and who said what to whom. She's not interested in the food. She has an extra problem, I might add, because Anglo-Saxons live in a culture which prides itself on not being interested in food. And therefore, you're not going to find out about food from the Anglo-Saxons. I'm leaving out today. We're different now. Now we all say, oh, and we came to lunch and what we had was this, and this. But that's very modern. It didn't happen in the past. People were not interested. They thought it was beneath interest. So you never hear what they ate. And it's annoying. I mean, I've tried this research. Every time I read it, they haven't said what they ate. Because we are weird. We're the weird ones, not them. They're normal. We are the really weird people. For the first time in history, we say, what did they eat? How did they hold themselves? What hand did they use? Everybody thought we were mad until now. They don't ask things like that. They're not interested.
You know, it's so funny. I normally live in Buenos Aires, and I remember when we were first looking at like apartments to buy, and we never did buy one, but you'd have these beautiful old buildings, you know, and the high ceilings, the molding, and it's still got that lovely old grandeur in a lot of these buildings. And then you would go to the kitchen area, and it was like horrible. It would be like this tiny little box. And American style housing nowadays is like, you have this big open kitchen, you have the island, it's set so people come in and watch you cook. And you really learn about the cultures in a way, because Americans cook in front of their friends and families, and cooking is part of the process, and everyone has to have this beautiful kitchen that allows guests. But obviously a lot of these beautiful old buildings in Buenos Aires, you weren't doing that. You had a maid. She was cooking in the back. You didn't care if your kitchen looked nice because she's doing it.
Damn, you didn't care how she lived. Okay, so there are ways in which we're better. You've got to realize that too. We're not only worse, we're also often better than they used to be. And it's fascinating to think that people weren't interested in telling you, how did those tables get moved to the kitchen? Why did they? And what happened? Nobody's ever thought it was worth drawing even on a pot, because often we get our information about food by what they painted on pots, and they didn't think it was worth it because it's just a slave. So you didn't put a slave on your pot, so you never know what happened. So you've lost the mechanics of the meal because they were not interested in telling you, because they thought you knew. They didn't think it was worth saying because they wanted to tell you something that you hadn't heard. So it's understandable, but it's not very, shall we say, moral or lofty or fine. I think we're better in that respect. And we would notice that there weren't any women at the party. However, as I said, I looked up the Symposium in Classics, and this is the Oxford Classical Dictionary, and I think the date is something like 1990, something like that. And they do not say there were no women. Can you believe that they didn't notice? That somebody in 1990 didn't notice that this meal had no women at it? It's incredible. I mean, so we still got a ways to go. We started, we've got a ways to go, So.
Well, I have another question then, if I may, and I know Lexi can jump in on some of the readers' questions because we've got a lot. But I was just going to ask maybe a broader question in that if manners are so essential and they're so necessary for social cohesion and everything, why aren't they more universal? Like, why are they so different? And, as somebody who travels a lot, you can run into faux pas so easily when you're the foreigner.
When you say men, do you mean males or do you mean human beings?
Human beings.
Oh, human beings. Oh, I see. Okay. I thought you meant men. Wow. Okay. So why are they so different? You're saying, why are they so different? Is that it? Was that
Well, I mean, even and I mean, even between the Athenians and the Spartans, and the Brits and the French, and the Americans and the Mexicans, like, everybody sort of has a different course that they do, and it's really easy to mess up if you're in the wrong place and you pick up the wrong fork, or you use your hands when you shouldn't be using your hands, or the chopstick, or
Well, that's part of their pride. When they actually think that they're better than everybody else, and everybody else is daft. You take. I mean, I was saying, we were talking about gratitude the other day, and one of the things is you realize that the Japanese have no word for thank you. So don't tell me that they know about gratitude. They don't even have a word for it. It's what they say is, if you do something for a Japanese person, they go arigato, arigato. That means this is poison to me. How can life be so hard? So you've done something for them, they say, this is poison to me. What is going on? And you have to understand it. You have to understand what has happened is that the Japanese feel that if I take an example of somebody, because this happened to me once, dropped something and somebody picks it up, and I say, oh, this is poison to me. It's because this man had to pick up this thing. I'm really sorry. It's a way of saying, it means also I'm very sorry. I'm so sorry that you had to come by when I dropped my book, and you are so good you picked it up. And now I'm in perpetual obligation to you for the rest of my life because you've been so, and I'll have to do something for you. So in other words, you've taken on a huge thing if somebody does something for you. It's not like thank you. So in order to understand what we mean by thank you, I had to study about, I don't know how many different cultures who didn't have thank you and figure out what they had instead. I couldn't understand myself until I studied all these other people who don't do it. And that's very interesting. I find that really fascinating because each society has worked out their own system and they have their own way of seeing things, and it's not ours. What is happening now, of course, is that there's been a huge thing, so also new in the history of the world, is this homogenization of all cultures now. It's getting flattened out, flattened out, flattened out. People are becoming more and more alike. And that can be good, but it can also be bad. I mean, it's not always a good thing. But anyway, it's just fascinating. You're right, it's fascinating. If you live abroad, you've got to realize that there are things you cannot do, You can't, for example, you must never criticize a French person. Just don't do it. That's fine. Just don't, because they can't stand it. They cannot bear it. Their culture has prepared them that you will never, you must never be caught out in a mistake, for example. If somebody says, you've made a mistake, you see, look at this and this, and they go berserk because they can't answer it. They can't show that it's not their fault.
Jane makes a great point, though, and as someone who spent time in France, and you live in France, Margaret, that the French don't like to be criticized, yet they're very, very glad to criticize others. And in fact, there's a really strong culture of peer-to-peer accountability in France as well, that like if you're doing something wrong, they will say, like, do not do that. What are you doing? And in fact, criticism there's a connection to intellectualism broadly, like to deconstruct, to be a critic. That is seen as the epitome of intellectual superiority, which is why they view Americans and happy-go-lucky other Western countries as like very dumb, because we're just so joyful. We're just glad to be in Paris, and they're like, you're insane and you're clearly stupid too. Instead of having like a discerning, discriminating.
The thing is that they hate being criticized because they've been criticized all their lives. It's driven them crazy. They can't bear it because they know it so well. They were brought up, as children. They said, stop it.
Yes.
And they are I suppose it had, I mean, yes, it's true. You're right. They're intellectuals. And so they understand, they do it themselves. They obviously do it to their children. So the whole culture is caught in it. If they could only learn to accept being criticized, they'd be so much happier. But you can't say that to a French person. You can't say that. But I mean, and they live the way they want to live, and they can see, it's very painful, but they don't do anything to stop it. Right. And so you've got to know that as a foreigner, don't do that. Just don't do that, okay? So, because you will pay because they can't bear it.
Meanwhile, in the UK or Australia, you're always taking the mick, right?
Yes. That's true.
So really, really quickly, on the topic of thanks and gratitude, we were in your book, Margaret, The Gift of Thanks. Your whole opening chapter is a discussion on how many cultures around the world don't even have a vocabulary that literally says thank you. It's sometimes there are like loose approximations that kind of linguistically mean thank you. Like you were talking about Japanese a second ago. I think I recall you saying in your book that the Japanese, their thank you doesn't actually mean thank you. It means I'm very sorry. And it's like gradations of like, oh my word, I'm so sorry to be in your debt. Like you've done something incredibly kind for me. And I'm not just thanking you, like I'm very sorry to have even imposed on you in the first place. And it's like, and it's gradations of that instead, which I think is fabulous. So really tiny point on your book, Margaret, to our audience, we are giving away copies of her books, both The Rituals of Dinner and The Gift of Thanks. We have 3 copies each. So if you'd like to be entered, if you are a tweeting person, feel free to tweet about the event, what you've enjoyed about it, and tag Classical Wisdom and Civic Renaissance or my handle. I'll put that in the chat now. And we will be selecting winners at the end of this conversation. So just a way to show Margaret's book some love. So I know Margaret said that we'd have to have a whole separate series of conversations to talk about thanks, that manners in the ancient world is its own huge topic, and that we shouldn't infuse thanks. But I
shouldn't just introduce it. Anyway, I'm just trying to think. I'm sure there's hundreds of things I haven't said. Well, one of the things, you want us to stop now, is that right?
No. I think we're going to.
One of the things I didn't say, I talked about how each person at this dinner party we were describing has a little table, which is actually like a plate, and you eat from the table with your hand, okay? But in our culture, we don't have that. We have one table. And that is extremely important to our entire culture. We eat around a table, sitting on chairs, and that requires a table so that the food is at a level that you can eat from. And a table represents unity. It represents the unity of the group. And the Greeks had all kinds of ways of expressing unity. They could sing, they sang together during the meal, for example. We don't do that, but we do have this one table that we eat from. And that is, and they're having little separate tables is extraordinary to us. But of course, the Japanese each have a separate little table too. But I mean, but this one table is important for our whole culture. And the way the table is set expresses all kinds of things to us. For example, if you have a place where you eat and your plate is there, and then you have a knife, fork, and spoon, nobody else is allowed to impinge on your space. This is why you must keep your elbows in and you don't touch people. This is a metaphor for human rights. Human rights is expressed 3 times a day when we eat dinner together. Okay, it's just what I thought that might interest you. Maybe it doesn't. You don't look interested. Let's try something else. Anything else? Are you running out of time? What is it?
No, we were only just trying to read some of the questions, to be honest, because there are so many, and I feel like it would be amiss of us if we didn't reference some of them, because so many people have been writing one. So if I can ask a few, and maybe because I know we don't want to use up too much of your time, and I know it's quite late already there in France, so maybe we can do a few quick ones. But one from Sean was, how important was storytelling or singing to banquets and meals? I'm thinking of Odysseus and the Phaeacians. How realistic would something like that be?
Yes. Well, you can see that I mentioned Plato's Symposium. That's obviously an obvious one, but this became a literary genre. People talking at dinner. It comes called propos de table, the French call it. It's a minor genre in literature. It was very important to talk. In fact, one of the most peculiar things about all our table manners to everybody is that in the West, when you're having dinner, you have to talk. If you don't talk, you're extremely rude. It means you try to just eat and you're not interested in talking. Okay, and although we must talk, we must never be seen with our mouths open so that you can see the food in the mouth. So it's extremely difficult to do. If you realize how hard it is to have to talk but never open your mouth, can you imagine? I mean, this is a terrible feat we've had to learn from childhood. Okay, so and that has a whole big background in Greek categories as well. But anyway, that's another point about eating. It's probably the strangest one that foreigners find about us. Because in a lot of cultures, you don't talk when you're eating. Huh? You eat silently. You're busy. You're getting your pieces and you're using your hands, and it's from a common plate and all that. Whereas it's already decided for us. We just do this, but we must talk, but never open your mouth.
You think of the Greeks, where you have the sort of the two-part of the dinner, that kind of makes sense, where you eat first and then you drink wine and talk. And that's something you still see in Latin cultures today. They call it the sobremesa, and that's where you stay and you talk afterwards, and that's where you can not be rude or
especially stay at the table, because that still continues to represent your unity. So after the dinner, you have hacer la sobremesa, and this goes on now for hours. You'll talk till 2 a.m. But all around the table, you don't leave the room, you sit there and talk. And that has stayed. That comes directly from the ancient world.
There was another question that the classic writers didn't write about what the common people ate, but are there archaeological records showing anything about meals and food for everyone other than the heroes and the elites? And I mean, I specifically am thinking, just off the top of my head, we had a recent discovery in Pompeii of the fast food stall. So I guess there might be some interesting archaeological evidence of daily life.
Well, how have people found out? We found out an enormous amount. It's extraordinary because the ancients, you remember, it's Greece and Rome. They tend to put them together. And if you do that, you've got two huge civilizations. That's a lot. Yeah. And they've left a lot of writings. And even if small things, they've picked them up. They've had hundreds of years of combing through all the sources, but not noticing that women weren't allowed. They could notice what food you ate, but not that the woman wasn't allowed. I mean, extraordinary, isn't it? Well, people find what they're looking for. Okay, and people were looking for food. What were they having? And you have a lot of information about what they had for breakfast. The word for breakfast means eating. You take bread and put it in an unmixed wine, and then you eat that. And you can tell from the word that's what that means. There are all kinds of ways you can guess. And the food hasn't changed except for the additions of the things from America, like beans and tomatoes and potatoes. They didn't have any of that. So, but we can guess, and then we knew they had a lot of cheese. That's very, very important, because they had sheep and they had these flocks and they used that to make food. You're trying to say, do you want to know what sauces there are? Is that what you want to know?
There's the garum sauce, right? That's the fish sauce that still exists.
Yes,
in the UK.
That's right. Yes, it does. And they ate much less fish than we thought. We thought that they always must have eaten fish as they do nowadays, but they didn't. They preferred meat. They just preferred meat, period. I don't know why they would not eat fish. If they were starving, they would. And you never hear of a hero eating fish, ever. The whole of the Iliad or the Odyssey. And they so we know they had bread, we know cheese, eggs, and even eggs were quite late. They didn't have chickens for a long time. They got them from Persia. And then only after that could they start having the eggs. So there are all kinds of, lot of history that goes into this, but and people have a wonderful time. The scholars adore that, going through all the sources and finding what they ate or what they did. But then you suddenly realize that they didn't mention that women weren't asked to the parties. Only we noticed that. We only noticed that recently, within the last few decades. Hundreds of years, and they never thought of it.
Yeah, it's amazing.
Absolutely unthinkable. They didn't even notice because they weren't looking. So you see, you can miss things by not asking the right question.
There's another question, actually, from Sean. To my mind, the most meaningful meal of ancient literature and myth is Priam and Achilles eating together near the end of the Iliad. Would a meal of reconciliation like that ever happen in the real ancient Greece, say between Athenians and Spartans?
Well, this is one of the great scenes of all literature, actually. It's one of the greatest scenes ever written, is the meeting between Priam and Achilles. Achilles had murdered Priam's son. And Achilles is angry, and it's incredible. And then they think of they look into the background of each of them, and they see how they've each suffered, and they realize that they have so much in common, and they forgive each other. Now, one of the things I mentioned earlier, that the Greeks were a shame culture. They were not a guilt culture. They were not, we are, in our world, which is a Christian world, we expect people to forgive each other. In the ancient world, it was very, very hard, much harder than it is for us. It's not set up, right? So when the greatest scene, perhaps in all of Greek literature, maybe in the Christian literature of the world, is a scene of forgiveness between two people like Priam and Achilles, just in the middle of a war, because the war wasn't over yet, is amazing. It's very hard to express the effect it has when you finished reading the Iliad, because it comes from way up there. It's not their culture. It's not what you expect. It's not what was expected of them. And they did it. It's so powerful, I can't even begin to express it. You have to read it yourself.
Yeah. It's true. It's a wonderful.
Amazing.
Margaret, I want to thank you on behalf of everyone here today who joined our conversation, as well as those who will view it in the future. Many people couldn't make it live, but we'll send out the recording to everyone who registered and post this on the interwebs as well for others to enjoy. But I want to thank you, Margaret, for your generous time and sharing your passion, your work with us, and helping us think a little bit differently and more clearly about something that we take for granted every day, which is just our social norms, our rituals, the things that again, that we do each day, that we depend on to interact harmoniously with others, but don't often pause enough to reflect on. And that's one thing I love about your work, is that you care about not just what we do, but why, what's the origin, and what's the reason behind, the purpose behind what we do, which I think is a really important perspective, especially in our very divided and broken moment today, where a lot of people aren't sure how they feel about things like manners and politeness and civility, and people often think that there are more important things than social norms and propriety and convention. So it's always interesting to kind of zoom out and look at the past and to kind of gain perspective about where we are today. So thank you so much for that. Thank you to Colin again. Colin, if you're there, thanks to Colin Visser for helping us with the technical side. Thanks, Chris, for managing our technical side of the Zoom, and Anya and I love putting together these conversations. So thanks to each of you who took the time to join us this afternoon live, and again to those of you who will enjoy the recording. This is brought to you again by Classical Wisdom, bringing ancient wisdom to modern minds, and also Civic Renaissance, my project and newsletter community dedicated to beauty and goodness and truth, and healing our public discourse with the wisdom of the past. And we're grateful to all of you for being here, and thanks again to Margaret for facilitating this conversation.
Thank you very much for asking me.
Anything you want to say?
I just want to say thank you as well, and thank you to Margaret, and also to our lovely audience. Everybody's been writing in a beautiful chat, and Margaret, I don't know if you can see the chat, but there are so many thanks to you from all of our listeners as well. So I'm so glad you could join us.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great afternoon.
Bye.